In the heart of Manhattan's Fifth Avenue, where brownstone facades kissed the rising sun and horse-drawn carriages carried silk-draped secrets, the whispers began like wildfire. "She's nothing but a fortune hunter," they'd say, fanning themselves in parlors filled with lace and judgment. Her name was Clara Belle Wrenfield, a woman who did not come from money, but from shadows, daughter of a seamstress, niece of a drunkard, raised in a boarding house that smelled of starch and desperation. And yet, she dined at the Astoria Club. She wore Parisian gloves, white as snow and nearly as rare in her part of town. And perhaps worst of all, she caught the eye of Magnus Van Derwell, the most powerful railroad tycoon east of the Mississippi. Their first meeting had been accidental, or so it seemed. Magnus, then 64, had built empires of steel and coal. A widower, gruff, widely feared, but his fortune was unrivaled. His beard silver, his shoes shined by men who didn't dare look him in the eye. He'd walked into an art exhibit, one of those forgettable social events his board insisted he attend once a season. And there she stood, Clara. Not in satin, not in jewels, just a fitted navy blue dress and a gaze that looked through him, not at him. He offered to buy her favorite painting. She laughed. "You couldn't afford it, Mr. Van Derwell," she said, smiling as if she knew something he didn't. And from that moment, something in him cracked open like rusted iron. The courtship wasn't swift, but it was scandalous. He sent her books, not diamonds. She sent him poems, not photographs. The newspapers dubbed her the dressmaker's duchess, a phrase soaked in sarcasm and venom. Socialites sneered at her in public. Some refused to attend any event where she might appear. The Rockefellers exchanged letters with the Astors, warning of her influence. They said, "Watch her hands. They sow ambition." But Clara remained poised, silent, smiling. She did not fight the rumors. She outlasted them. And then came the wedding. Private, no orchestra, just a minister, a small chapel in upstate New York, and a winter storm that nearly buried them before vows could be said. He was nearly 30 years her senior. She was barely 28. When he kissed her hand before the final prayer, she whispered something only he could hear. Some say it was, "Thank you." Others believe it was, "You'll see." Either way, the scandal was no longer rumor, it was law. But what none of them knew, not the heiresses, not the gossips, not even the iron men of Wall Street, was that Clara Belle Wrenfield had not married into power. She had just inherited the storm. And winter, as if conspiring with fate, refused to let up. Snow clung to the rooftops like unspoken accusations. Icicles hung from the wrought iron railings of Fifth Avenue like knives waiting for a name. In the weeks following the wedding, Clara did not host grand teas or announce herself with carriages and calling cards. Instead, she vanished. Not into scandal, but into shadow, retreating with Magnus to their Montauk estate, where the only noise louder than the waves was the ticking of clocks. It was there, behind frosted windows and heavy velvet curtains, that the real whispers began. Not from the press, but from the staff. "She never touches the jewelry," murmured the butler. "She burns her letters," said the cook. "She walks the gardens at night, alone," Lisbeth whispered, her voice quaking like the candle in her hand. Magnus noticed, too. Though he had given Clara the world, she had accepted it like a surgeon accepts a scalpel, precisely, not passionately. At breakfast, she folded napkins like secrets. At night, she read ledger books like scripture. Once, he asked her if she missed her old life. She looked up from her tea and said only, "I remember it."
Then came the guests. Not friends, but sentinels of suspicion. Mrs. Theodora Whitby, draped in widow's black since 1872 and still mourning her relevance, arrived uninvited one afternoon with a basket of oranges and 1,000 unspoken threats. "You must be so lonely out here, dear," she said, eyes scanning the parlor as if counting potential inheritances. Clara only smiled. She was good at smiling. When Jonas Kellerman arrived with legal documents for Magnus's signature, he stayed longer than needed, his gaze lingering too long on Clara, too little on the ink. "She'll have his signature on more than paper soon enough," he would later mutter in a mahogany-paneled club in Manhattan. But within the walls of the Montauk mansion, Clara moved with grace and silence, never flinching, never faltering, until one evening Magnus asked her to dance. No guests, no music, just a phonograph playing some brittle Strauss, and his trembling hand reaching for hers. She hesitated, not out of fear, but memory. She took his hand anyway. They danced once, twice, then stopped. And as he looked into her eyes, eyes that had once challenged him in a gallery filled with paintings, he whispered, "Tell me something true, Clara." She leaned closer, her breath warm against the cold room. She said, "I will." But she didn't. Not that night. And perhaps not ever. Because even love, when built on power, must withstand 1,000 silences before it's believed. And outside, the snow kept falling. But inside, something else had begun to melt.
Spring did not arrive with blossoms that year. It came with paper. Gossip columns, inheritance rumors, and the scratch of pens etching Clara Belle Van Derwell's name into scandal. She had survived the winter, but society had sharpened its claws for spring. At the opera, no one greeted her. At tea rooms, whispers filled her absence. They called her the widow who waited. Even as Magnus still lived, though weaker now, breath shorter, hands trembling during chess, his presence became secondary. The real headlines belonged to her. The dressmaker's duchess had become the velvet widow. and Magnus, despite his steel empire, could not shield her from the social knives. It was Augustus who struck first, Magnus's only son, raised in cigar smoke and entitlement, returned from a necessary voyage to London. He kissed his father's cheek with lips that didn't smile and shook Clara's hand like it held disease. He came bearing concern, but it was accusation he carried. He demanded audits, questioned property transfers, insisted Magnus revoke power of attorney. Magnus refused, and for that Augustus withdrew, retreating into back rooms of clubs and legal counsel, preparing for what he called the inevitable. Magnus, for all his power, seemed smaller now. He coughed blood on the sheets, forgot names at breakfast, but Clara never left his side. She did not weep in public. She did not defend herself. She waited, and as she waited, the world turned. Letters arrived. Anonymous. What did she promise him to rewrite a legacy? She'll auction his bones next. Watch the Montauk estate. That's where it ends. She burned them all except one. A single note, unsigned, left at her door one night in Montauk. Not even veils had ghosts forever. She folded it, tucked it into her prayer book, and told no one. Then, one Sunday in May, Magnus collapsed during breakfast. He reached for the cream, blinked twice, and fell against the sideboard. Lisbeth screamed. Clara didn't. She knelt beside him, whispering his name. He opened his eyes for a moment, looked not at her, but past her, and smiled. Then he was gone. And just like that, the empire was hers. But it wasn't the inheritance that stunned New York. It was what happened next. At the reading of the will, inside a marble room at Pemberton and Stratton, Augustus arrived dressed like a mourner, but smiled like a predator. Clara wore a short black veil, no jewelry, just a folded letter in her gloved hand. And when the executor read the words, "To my beloved wife, Clara Belle Van Derwell, I leave the controlling interest in all Van Derwell rail and coal operations, the Montauk estate, and full executive rights over my intellectual and industrial holdings," there was a silence that rippled like thunder. Augustus stood. No, this is fraud." Another cousin fainted. Aunt Helena clutched her pearls so hard they snapped. Clara said nothing. Not then. She simply bowed her head slightly and walked out. The New York Tribune would call it a funeral of fortune and a widow who blinked at nothing. But even they didn't know Clara's story was just beginning, because while Augustus fumed, someone else was already digging through the shadows of Montauk, and what they found would change everything.
New York had seen scandals before. Affairs, debts, elopements to Paris, divorces whispered in yacht clubs and threats exchanged over cigars. But this was different, because this time the woman didn't flinch. Clara Belle Van Derwell, widow, heiress, outsider, did not grant interviews. She did not retreat to Europe or bury herself in Newport. She stayed in Montauk, in the very house where Magnus had died. And that, according to the New York Tribune, was an audacious act of either bravery or guilt. They named her the Velvet Widow, a title that dripped with equal parts envy and contempt. The article ran for 7 days. Day 1, the scandal. Day 2, the fortune. Day 3, the portraits. Yes, she'd sat for one. Day 4, the silence. Day 5, the storm. Day 6, the will. Day 7, the woman who said nothing. It was a journalistic opera, and Clara, though absent, was the lead soprano. In the salons of Manhattan, crystal clinked over conversations that always returned to her name. "I heard she poisoned his coffee," said Mrs. Delancey, stirring her own with exaggerated caution. "Her hands are too still," murmured a widowed baroness. "No woman that young mourns without shaking." Yet none could point to proof. Not even Augustus. And Augustus tried. He hired investigators, sought doctors to declare Magnus mentally unfit, paid a former gardener to swear Clara had once buried something unholy beneath the greenhouse. None of it stuck, because Clara's defense wasn't legal. It was behavioral. She did nothing suspicious. No flamboyant spending, no sudden travels. She wore black, kept the house quiet, dismissed no staff, but added no new ones. She was neutral.
And that frightened people more than any tantrum could have. But behind closed doors, in a parlor filled with lilacs and silence, she met with Ambrose Godfrey. He was older, bookish, and loyal to the grave. He'd been Magnus's legal confidant for years and had warned him, gently, about the risks of leaving it all to Clara. Now he served her. "Augustus is rallying," he said softly one morning. "He'll file within the week." "On what grounds?" she asked, sipping cold tea. "Influence, isolation, coercion, the usual for disinherited sons." Clara smiled faintly. "Let him. You understand the scrutiny. I've understood it since the day I wore Parisian gloves to a tea party." Ambrose almost smiled. "Then we prepare?" She nodded. "We endure." But even as the legal gears turned, whispers traveled faster. 2 servants were bribed. One claimed to have seen Magnus writing a second will. Another swore Clara had burned it after his death. The Tribune printed both rumors. Augustus gave interviews, and yet Clara said nothing. Until one evening, alone in the Montauk library, she wrote a single line in her journal. Let them bring fire. I know where the ashes belong. That page would one day sit behind museum glass. But first, it would survive courtrooms, headlines, betrayals, and the one secret not even Magnus had known. A secret buried beneath Montauk with something more than velvet. Something that would bleed.
They bribed servants, they printed lies, they whispered as if the walls wouldn't carry the echo, but I wrote it down. Let them bring fire. I know where the ashes belong.
But the bleeding hadn't started yet. That would come in court. To be continued in part 2.